August 9th, 2004, downtown Phoenix, Arizona. The temperature's already climbing past 100 degrees before most people finish their morning coffee, and on the scorching sidewalk at 3rd Avenue and West Madison Street, someone notices a man lying there, unconscious. No wallet, no ID, no phone, nothing to tell anyone who he is. Phoenix Emergency Medical Services rushes him to the hospital where doctors work frantically to save him. But 8 days later, he dies, and nobody, absolutely nobody, knows his name. For 20 years, this man remained a ghost, a John Doe, in a system that desperately tried to give him back his identity. His fingerprints led nowhere. His DNA matched nothing in any database. And his face, well, nobody came forward to claim him. He became case number 004 in the Maricopa County Medical Examiner's files. Just another nameless victim of the desert heat. Another soul lost in the shuffle of a big city's daily tragedies. But here's what nobody expected. 2 decades later, a group of college students in New Jersey, working with cutting-edge genetic genealogy technology, would crack this case wide open, and the answer they found, the real identity of this man and the circumstances that brought him to that Phoenix sidewalk, would shock everyone involved and prove that even the coldest cases can suddenly burn red hot with the right tools and the right determination. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This isn't just another cold case story where some detective had a hunch or a witness finally came forward after years of guilt. No, this is about how modern science, specifically investigative genetic genealogy, the same kind of technology that caught the Golden State Killer, is now being wielded by undergraduate students to solve mysteries that stumped professional investigators for decades. It's about how a man's brother reported him missing in Toledo, Ohio, just weeks after our John Doe collapsed on that Phoenix street, but somehow, someway, nobody connected those dots for 20 years. And it's about what happens when a family spends 2 decades wondering, searching, hoping, and grieving without answers, only to finally learn the truth when they've almost given up hope. The breakthrough in this case happened in late 2024 when the Maricopa County Office of the Medical Examiner reached out to the Ramapo College Investigative Genetic Genealogy Center in Mahwah, New Jersey. These folks had been making waves in the forensic community. They'd already helped solve 25 cases and were working on dozens more. And when they took on this Phoenix John Doe, they had no idea they were about to connect a missing person case from Ohio to an unidentified body in Arizona that had been sitting in the system for 20 years. Let me paint you the full picture here, because the details matter. It's August 2004. George W. Bush is president. The Summer Olympics are happening in Athens. Facebook just launched a few months earlier, but it's still only available to college students. The world is different, technology is different, and Phoenix, Arizona, is experiencing one of its typically brutal summers, where the heat doesn't just make you uncomfortable, it kills you if you're not careful. The man who would remain nameless for 2 decades is found at 3rd Avenue and West Madison, right in the heart of downtown Phoenix. Not in some remote desert location, not in an abandoned building, but on a public sidewalk, where hundreds of people probably walk past every single day. He's alive when they find him, but he's unconscious. His body temperature dangerously high, showing all the signs of severe heat exposure. And here's the thing, Phoenix in August is no joke. We're talking temperatures that regularly exceed 115 degrees. Asphalt that can literally cook an egg. Air so dry, it pulls moisture from your lungs with every breath. And this man is lying there exposed to all of it. Emergency responders do everything right. They get him to the hospital. Doctors begin aggressive treatment for hypothermia. They're cooling his body, managing his vital signs, doing everything medical science can do, but the damage is too severe. 8 days later, he succumbs to his injuries, and the official cause of death is listed as heat exposure. But even as he's fighting for his life in that hospital bed, Even as doctors and nurses work around the clock to save him, nobody knows who to call, who to notify. Who this man is. Phoenix Police Department immediately begins the identification process because when someone dies without ID in a major city, there's a protocol. You take fingerprints, you photograph the deceased, you document any distinguishing marks, scars, tattoos, anything that might help identify them. You run those fingerprints through every database available, local, state, federal. IFIS, which is the Integrated Automated Fingerprint Identification System. You check missing persons reports, you contact neighboring jurisdictions, you do everything by the book. And in this case, they did all of that and came up empty, absolutely nothing. The fingerprints didn't match anyone in the system, which could mean he'd never been arrested, never been fingerprinted for a job or military service, never been in the system at all. Or it could mean the databases just didn't talk to each other the way they needed to. Remember, this is 2004. Technology is advancing, but it's not seamless. Different agencies use different systems. Information doesn't flow the way it does today. They take DNA samples too, standard procedure for unidentified remains. They create a DNA profile and enter it into CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, hoping for a match with missing persons cases or something, anything that could give them a lead. But again, nothing, no hits, no matches, no family coming forward with a missing persons report that lines up with their John Doe. And so this man, this human being who had a life, a family, a story, becomes a file number, becomes a cold case, becomes one of thousands of unidentified deceased individuals in America. The system does what it's supposed to do, which is to preserve his remains and his case file, waiting, always waiting, for that breakthrough that might never come. But what nobody in Phoenix knew in August 2004 was that 3 weeks after this man was found unconscious on that sidewalk, on September 1st, 2004, a man named John Thieleson was reported missing by his brother in Toledo, Ohio. John Thieleson, 42 years old, dealing with significant mental health challenges, had made a disturbing phone call to his sister around that same time. He told her he had cleansed himself and was planning to jump into an Ohio river. Those were the kinds of words that make your blood run cold. The kind of statement that tells you someone is in a very dark place. And after that call, John Thieleson disappeared. Completely. His family filed a missing persons report. They searched. They worried. They hoped he'd turn up somewhere safe, maybe in a hospital or a shelter. Maybe he'd get help and come back to them. But weeks turned into months, months turned into years, and John Thieleson remained missing. His case went cold, just like thousands of other missing persons cases do every single year in America. The brutal reality is that when an adult goes missing, especially an adult with mental health issues, especially when that adult made statements about self-harm, the assumption often becomes the worst-case scenario. And without a body, without evidence, without leads, there's only so much investigators can do. Now here's where this story gets really interesting, really frustrating, and ultimately really important for understanding how the system both failed and eventually succeeded. You have an unidentified deceased man in Phoenix whose cause of death is heat exposure. And you have a missing person from Toledo who made statements about jumping into a river. On the surface, these cases don't match. Different states, different circumstances. Phoenix is desert heat and Ohio is river water. How would anyone connect those dots? But they're the same person. They're absolutely the same person. And for 20 years, nobody knew it. Nobody could have known it with the tools available at the time. The missing persons databases and the unidentified deceased databases existed, but they didn't communicate effectively. The technology for comparing DNA from unidentified remains to potential family members of missing persons was expensive, time-consuming, and not widely used. And unless someone specifically requested a comparison between Toledo's missing person and Phoenix's John Doe, which nobody had any reason to do, these cases would remain separate. parallel tragedies that never intersected. Think about what this means for a minute. Think about John Thielison's family, his brother who filed that missing persons report, his sister who received that final disturbing phone call, his parents, his friends, everyone who knew him and wondered what happened. For 20 years, they lived in limbo, not knowing if he was alive somewhere, suffering from mental illness and unable or unwilling to make contact, or if he had indeed acted on his statements about self-harm. They couldn't have a funeral, couldn't have closure, couldn't move through the stages of grief that people need to heal, because how do you grieve when you don't know? How do you accept death when there's always that tiny possibility that maybe, just maybe, he's still out there somewhere? This is the torture of ambiguous loss, the psychological term for the unique pain of not knowing what happened to someone you love. Researchers have found that families of missing persons often experience prolonged suffering that exceeds even the grief of losing someone to a confirmed death, because at least death has finality, has closure, has rituals and traditions that help people process their loss. But ambiguous loss, that's a special kind of hell where you're stuck between hope and despair, unable to fully commit to either one. And on the other side of this tragedy, you have the professionals who work this case, the medical examiners who carefully preserved John Doe's remains and his case file for 2 decades, the Phoenix police detectives who investigated, the missing persons advocates who kept his case on their radar. These people don't give up. They understand that every John and Jane Doe is someone's loved one, someone's family member, someone who deserves their name back. But they're also working with limited resources, with hundreds or thousands of other cases, with technology that until recently simply couldn't do what needed to be done. The Maricopa County Office of the Medical Examiner maintained this case meticulously. They kept biological samples properly stored. They kept records updated. They periodically reviewed the case to see if any new leads had emerged. And most importantly, when new technology became available, when investigative genetic genealogy started proving itself as a viable tool for solving cold cases, they were willing to try it, willing to reach out to Ramapo College and say, "We need help with this one." That decision, that willingness to embrace new technology and new approaches, that's what broke this case wide open September 2024. 20 years and 1 month after John Thielison was reported missing in Toledo, the Maricopa County Medical Examiner's Office contacts the Ramapo College Investigative Genetic Genealogy Center. They explain the case, they provide what information they have, and the IGG Center agrees to take it on. Now, this isn't a simple process. Investigative genetic genealogy isn't like running a fingerprint through a database and getting an instant match. It's painstaking, detailed work that requires expertise in both genetics and genealogy. It requires sending samples to specialized labs. It requires building family trees going back multiple generations. It requires comparing DNA to find distant relatives and then working forward through time to identify possible candidates. And it requires undergraduate students, yes, college students, working under the supervision of experienced professionals to do much of this detective work. The first step in the process is getting usable DNA. Now, you might think, well, they already had DNA from 2004. Just use that, but it's not quite that simple. DNA degrades over time. The samples collected 20 years ago were preserved, but they need to be processed using modern techniques that didn't exist back then. So the Maricopa County Medical Examiner's Office sends a blood sample to Genelog, a specialized lab in Tucker, Georgia. These folks are experts in extracting DNA from degraded or compromised samples, from old blood samples, from remains that have been exposed to the elements, from evidence that's been sitting in storage for decades. And what they do is perform whole genome sequencing. This is cutting-edge stuff. Instead of just looking at specific markers like older DNA testing did, whole genome sequencing reads the entire genetic code, all 3 billion base pairs, giving investigators a complete genetic blueprint to work with. This takes time, takes expertise, takes expensive equipment, But it's what makes modern investigative genetic genealogy possible. Once Genealog completes the sequencing, they send the results to another firm, Parabon Nanolabs in Virginia. And this is where things get really sophisticated. Parabon Nanolabs specializes in what they call bioinformatics. Essentially, they take that raw genetic data and transform it into a format that can be used for genealogical research. They develop something called a genotype file, which is basically a roadmap of someone's genetic markers that can be compared to other people's genetic information. They also do phenotyping, which means they can predict physical characteristics from DNA. Things like eye color, hair color, skin tone, facial structure. This technology is so advanced, it's almost like science fiction. Imagine being able to create a portrait of someone just from their DNA. And while phenotyping wasn't the key to solving this particular case, it's part of the arsenal that modern forensic genealogists have at their disposal. Anyway, Parabon processes the data and sends those genotype files to the Ramapo College IGG Center in November 2024. And this is where the real detective work begins. This is where college students become cold case investigators. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Investigative Genetic Genealogy Center at Ramapo College is kind of amazing when you think about it. This is an academic program where students learn forensic genealogy by working on actual cases. Real unsolved mysteries, real unidentified remains, and they're supervised by professionals who have years of experience in this field. But the students, these undergraduates who are learning the craft, they're the ones who spend hours and hours building family trees, searching through genealogical databases, tracking down records, making connections that solve cases which have stumped professional investigators for years or decades. It's hands-on learning at its finest, and it's producing real results. 28 cases solved so far, including 3 in Arizona. 39 more cases currently being worked. And our Phoenix John Doe is about to become number 29. The team uploads the genotype files to 2 databases, GEDmatch Pro and Family Tree DNA. Now these are not law enforcement databases. These are genealogical databases where people voluntarily upload their DNA results from consumer testing companies like 23andMe or Ancestry.com, hoping to find relatives, trace their family history, maybe solve some family mysteries of their own. And crucially, these users have opted into allowing their DNA to be used for law enforcement purposes. This is important because there's been a lot of controversy about genetic privacy, about law enforcement using DNA databases, but these particular databases require explicit consent. Nobody's DNA is being used without their knowledge. And the people who opt in often do so specifically because they want to help solve crimes or identify missing persons. The students start searching for matches, looking for people whose DNA shows they're related to the Phoenix John Doe. And here's where the science gets interesting. When you upload DNA to these databases, you don't just get matches for close relatives like parents or siblings or first cousins. You get matches for distant relatives, people who share a common ancestor with you from several generations back. Maybe you share great-great-grandparents. Maybe you share great-great-great-grandparents. The further back the common ancestor, the lower the percentage of shared DNA. And in this case, the closest matches they find are third cousins. That means John Doe and these DNA matches share great-great-grandparents. That's going back 4 generations. That's the mid-1800s in most cases. And you have to build a family tree from those common ancestors all the way forward to the present day to identify who this person might be. It's like working a puzzle, except you have to create most of the pieces yourself from genealogical records, census data, birth records, death records, marriage records, military records, anything and everything that documents people's lives and families. Karen Binder, the assistant director of the IGG Center, explains it perfectly. She says there can be anything from a sibling to a parent, to a third or fifth or more distant cousin. In this case, they were quite distant relatives. The closest match they had was third cousin, but they were able to build those genetic relatives backward, in time, to find common ancestors between them. That's how they reverse-engineered the family tree of the person they're looking for. Think about what that means. They're starting with two people who share DNA. Third cousins who might not even know each other, might live on opposite sides of the country, and they're working backward through time, generation by generation, finding the common ancestors, documenting every birth, every marriage, every child, building out massive family trees that include hundreds or thousands of individuals. And then, once they've identified those common ancestors, they work forward through time, following every branch of the family tree down to the present day, documenting every descendant, until they can narrow down who the Phoenix John Doe might be. This process takes time, weeks or months. The students are cross-referencing genealogical databases, searching through Ancestry.com, family search, newspaper archives, obituaries, city directories, anywhere they might find information about these families. And they're building multiple family trees simultaneously because they have multiple DNA matches to work with. And somewhere in the overlap between these different family trees is their answer. Somewhere in the intersection of these genealogical lines is the identity of the man who died in Phoenix 20 years ago. And eventually, finally, they find him. They identify two relatives, both third cousins of a man named John Thielisson. The name doesn't mean anything to them at first. They're not looking for a specific name. They're just following the genealogical evidence wherever it leads. But they've got a candidate. They've got a possible identity, and now they need to verify it. They send their findings back to the Maricopa County Medical Examiner's office with all their documentation, all their genealogical research, all the evidence showing how they traced the family tree from those DNA matches back to common ancestors and forward to John Thielisson. And the medical examiner's office looks at this name and something clicks. The Maricopa County office reaches out to the Arizona Attorney General's Cold Case Unit. This specialized unit was created specifically to tackle unsolved homicides and unidentified remains using new technologies and fresh approaches. And they're about to prove their worth on this case. The Cold Case Unit starts investigating John Thielisson. Who was he? Where was he from? And most importantly, is there any record of him being missing? And that's when everything comes together. That's when they discover the Toledo Police Department missing persons report from September 1st, 2004. Just 3 weeks after the Phoenix John Doe was found unconscious on that sidewalk. The timeline fits, the age fits. John Thielisson was 42 when he went missing, which matches the estimated age of their John Doe. And suddenly, two cases that have been sitting in separate systems for 20 years are revealed to be the same case, the same person, the same tragedy. But they still need definitive proof. DNA from third cousins can point you in the right direction, but it's not enough for a positive identification. You need closer relatives. You need direct family, if possible. So the Attorney General's Cold Case Unit reaches out to John Thielisson's family in Ohio. And imagine this moment. Imagine being John Thielisson's brother or sister. You filed a missing persons report in 2004. You've spent 20 years wondering what happened to him, wondering if he's alive somewhere, hoping against hope that maybe somehow he survived whatever crisis he was going through. And suddenly you get a call from Arizona, from a cold case unit, saying they may have found your brother. They need a DNA sample. They need your help to confirm his identity. And you realize that the hope you've been clinging to for 2 decades is about to be confirmed or destroyed forever. One of John Thielisson's siblings agrees to provide a DNA sample. This is straightforward, just a cheek swab or blood sample. Simple procedure, but profoundly significant. This sample is compared to the DNA from the Phoenix John Doe, and in March 2025, 20 years and 7 months after he was found on that Phoenix sidewalk. The match is confirmed. Positive identification. The Phoenix John Doe is absolutely, definitively, without any doubt, John Thieleson from Toledo, Ohio. The case is solved. The mystery is answered. After 2 decades, the man who died nameless finally gets his identity back. And the family in Ohio finally gets the closure they've needed for so long. But with that closure comes a flood of questions. What was John doing in Phoenix? How did he get from Toledo to Arizona? What happened in those weeks between his disturbing phone call and his death in the desert? Did he come to Phoenix intentionally, or did he somehow end up there by accident? Was he trying to start over, trying to disappear? Or was his journey to Phoenix just the tragic result of mental illness and confusion? According to Toledo Police Department records, John Thieleson was dealing with significant mental health issues in the months and weeks before he disappeared. Mental illness is one of the most challenging aspects of missing persons cases because it can cause people to act unpredictably, to travel without a clear plan, to lose touch with reality, to put themselves in danger without understanding the risks. And when John called his sister talking about having cleansed himself and planning to jump into a river, those are the words of someone in acute psychological crisis. Someone who needs immediate help, immediate intervention. But in 2004, mental health resources were even more limited than they are today. And if John decided to leave Toledo, if he got on a bus or started hitchhiking or somehow made his way west, there was no way for his family to track him. No cell phone pinging towers to trace his movements. No social media posts to give clues about his location. He simply vanished into the vast American landscape. The journey from Toledo, Ohio to Phoenix, Arizona is about 1,700 miles. That's not a casual trip. That's not something that happens by accident. Whether John took a bus, hitchhiked, or somehow had access to a vehicle, he traveled a significant distance. And somewhere along that journey, or after he arrived in Phoenix, his mental and physical condition deteriorated to the point where he ended up unconscious on a downtown sidewalk, dying from heat exposure. Did he have money when he left Toledo? If so, what happened to it? Did he have identification documents that were lost or stolen somewhere along the way? Was he alone? Or did he encounter people who might have helped him or taken advantage of his vulnerable state? These are questions that will probably never be fully answered, because the witnesses, if any existed, are long gone. The evidence, if any existed, has been lost to time. What we know for certain is that John Thieleson's journey ended on 3rd Avenue and West Madison Street in Phoenix, under the brutal August sun, far from home, far from family, and without the identification that might have allowed someone to notify his loved ones before it was too late. Heat exposure deaths in Phoenix are tragically common. Every summer, the city sees dozens of people die from the heat, many of them experiencing homelessness, many dealing with mental illness or substance abuse issues that make them particularly vulnerable, many who are simply unprepared for how brutal the Arizona summer can be. Visitors from cooler climates sometimes don't understand that Phoenix heat isn't like summer heat anywhere else. When the temperature hits 115 degrees, the human body simply cannot cool itself effectively, no matter how healthy you are. You sweat, but the sweat evaporates so quickly in the dry desert air that you don't realize how much fluid you're losing. Dehydration sets in fast, and once your core body temperature starts rising above normal, organ damage begins. Your brain starts to malfunction. You become confused, disoriented, unable to make rational decisions. You might take off your clothes because you feel burning up. You might wander into even more exposed areas looking for relief, and eventually your body just shuts down. It's a horrible way to die, and it happens more often than most people realize. For someone like John Thieleson, already dealing with mental health challenges, already in a state of psychological crisis, the Phoenix heat would have been especially dangerous if he was confused or disoriented due to his mental state. He might not have recognized the signs of heat illness, might not have sought shade or water, might not have understood the danger he was in until it was too late. And if he was without resources, without money for food or water or shelter, the streets of downtown Phoenix in August become a death trap. There are cooling stations, there are shelters, there are resources available, but you have to know about them, and you have to be capable of accessing them. And for someone in John's state, that might not have been possible. Witnesses who saw him before he collapsed might have assumed he was just another person experiencing homelessness, might have walked past without offering help, might have called it in to authorities who were already overwhelmed with similar calls every single day during heat season. The sad reality is that one person lying on a sidewalk in downtown Phoenix during summer doesn't necessarily draw the immediate response it should, because it's such a common sight. But here's what makes this case resolution so important beyond just giving John Thiessen his name back. This case demonstrates what investigative genetic genealogy can do, how it can solve mysteries that were completely unsolvable just a decade ago. Think about the technology timeline here. Consumer DNA testing didn't really take off until the mid-2010s. 23andMe launched in 2006. Ancestry.com added DNA testing in 2012, but it took years for the databases to grow large enough to be useful for investigative purposes. It wasn't until 2018 when investigators used GEDmatch to identify the Golden State Killer that law enforcement really understood the potential of this technology. And even then, it took time for the techniques to be refined, for training programs to be developed, for medical examiners and police departments to understand how to use these tools. The Ramapo College IgG Center was founded in 2022. They've been operating for just 3 years, and they've already solved 28 cases. That's remarkable, that's transformative. And they're training the next generation of forensic genealogists who will solve hundreds more cases in the years to come. Karen Binder, the assistant director, said something really profound when this case was announced. She said this case showcases the power of investigative genetic genealogy to close long-standing missing persons cases. Every John and Jane Doe is the answer to a family missing a loved one, and we will continue to do everything in our power to keep restoring their names and providing those answers. Think about that statement. Every unidentified body, every Jane Doe or John Doe lying in a medical examiner's office, or buried in a potter's field somewhere. Every single one of them is someone's answer. Someone's missing father or mother or brother or sister or child. Someone's loved one who disappeared and left behind people who need to know what happened. And now, finally, we have the technology to provide those answers. We have the ability to connect the dots between missing persons and unidentified remains, even when they're separated by thousands of miles and decades of time. That's powerful, that's justice, that's humanity at its best, using science and determination to ease the suffering of grieving families. Jessica Kearns, the regional coordinator with Missing People in America, works with families of missing persons every single day. She sees the toll that ambiguous loss takes on people. She sees families stuck in limbo for years or decades, unable to move forward because they don't know. And when this case was solved, she said something that really captures the importance of this work. She said any answer, whether it be positive or negative result, is very important to these families because every day is torture for them. These families need to be able to lay loved ones to rest in a proper way instead of not knowing. And she's absolutely right. When someone goes missing and you don't know if they're alive or dead, you can't grieve, you can't heal. You're stuck in this awful space where you're mourning someone who might still be alive or hoping for someone who might be dead. It's psychological torture. Studies have shown that families of missing persons experience higher rates of depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, complicated grief reactions, all because they don't have that one piece of information they need. They don't know what happened. Now John Thielsen's family knows. After 20 years and 7 months, they finally have their answer. their brother, their loved one. Died in Phoenix in August 2004, died from heat exposure, died far from home, but at least now they know. They can bring him home, they can have a funeral, they can have a grave to visit, they can mark his death certificate with a real date instead of leaving it as an open question. They can tell their children or grandchildren what happened to Uncle John instead of just saying he disappeared. They can close this chapter of their lives. It's not happy news. Finding out a loved one died 20 years ago is devastating, but it's closure. It's an answer. And after 2 decades of not knowing, that answer is everything. That answer is the difference between being stuck in limbo forever and being able to finally start to heal. The Ramapo College students who worked this case probably won't ever meet John Tillison's family. They probably won't attend any funeral or memorial service. They'll move on to the next case, the next John or Jane Doe who needs their identity restored, but their work on this case changed lives, gave a family peace, gave John Tillison his name back. And that's the kind of impact that most people never get to have in their careers. These students, these undergraduates learning forensic genealogy, they're literally changing the world one cold case at a time, and there are so many more cases waiting to be solved. According to the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, called NAMUS, there are more than 12,000 unidentified remains in the United States right now. 12,000 people who died without their names, without their families being notified, without anyone claiming them. 12,000 potential cases that could be solved using investigative genetic genealogy. And that number doesn't include the hundreds of thousands of active missing persons cases. People who disappeared and might be alive somewhere, or might be one of those unidentified remains. The scale of this problem is enormous, overwhelming. And for decades, it was largely unsolvable, because we just didn't have the tools to match missing persons to unidentified remains across jurisdictions and across time. But now we do. Now we have the technology. We have the techniques. We have the training programs. We have the databases. And most importantly, we have people willing to do this work. Willing to spend hours and hours building family trees, tracking down records, making connections that solve cases. Let's talk about the specifics of how investigative genetic genealogy actually works, because I think understanding the process helps people appreciate just how revolutionary this technology is. When you submit your DNA to a consumer testing company like 23andMe or Ancestry, they analyze about 700,000 specific locations in your genome called SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms. These are places where human DNA varies from person to person. And by comparing your SNPs to other people's SNPs, the company can tell you who you're related to and how closely. If you share 50% of your DNA with someone, they're probably a parent or sibling or child. If you share 25%, they're probably a grandparent or aunt or uncle or grandchild. If you share 12.5%, they're probably a first cousin, and so on down the line. By the time you get to third cousins, you're only sharing about 0.78% of your DNA. That's not very much, that's a tiny overlap. But it's enough to establish that you share common ancestors. Now, when forensic genealogists upload the DNA profile of an unidentified person to databases like GDmatch, they're looking for anyone who shares DNA with that person, no matter how distant the relationship, and then they start building family trees. They find the closest matches, usually multiple matches, and they research those people's ancestry, going back generation by generation until they find the common ancestors between the different matches. Let's say they find 3 third cousins who all match the John Doe. They build out the family tree for each of those 3 people going back 4 or 5 generations. And eventually they find the common ancestors. Maybe it's a couple who lived in Pennsylvania in the 1860s, had 8 children, and those children spread out across the country, having their own families. The forensic genealogist documents all of those descendants. Every child, every grandchild, every great-grandchild. building out this massive family tree that might include hundreds or thousands of people. And somewhere in that tree is the John Doe, the person who shares DNA with all three of those third cousins. But you can't just pick a random person from that tree and say, that's our guy. You have to narrow it down. You have to look at the demographics, the age, the gender, the physical characteristics if you have them, the geographical location, the timeline. You have to cross-reference with missing persons reports. You have to eliminate people who are definitely alive and accounted for. You have to narrow down your candidates until you have one or two or maybe three possible identities. And then you have to verify through direct DNA comparison with close family members. It's detective work, it's genealogical research, it's genetic analysis, all combined into this incredibly complex but powerful investigative technique. And the Ramapo College students are learning to do all of this. They're becoming experts in these techniques. They're going to go out into careers in law enforcement, in medical examiners' offices, in private investigation. And they're going to solve hundreds more cases using these skills. The cost of this process is worth mentioning too because it's not cheap. Extracting DNA from degraded samples costs money. Whole genome sequencing costs money. Developing genotype files costs money. The genealogical research takes hundreds of hours of skilled labor. All of this adds up. And for medical examiners' offices and police departments with limited budgets, investing in investigative genetic genealogy for cold cases means taking resources away from other priorities. That's why partnerships like the one between Maricopa County and Ramapo College are so valuable. Ramapo is providing the genealogical research as part of their educational program. Their students are doing this work as part of their training, which means the cost to the medical examiner's office is just the lab work, just the DNA extraction and sequencing. Still significant expenses, but more manageable than hiring private forensic genealogy firms, which can charge tens of thousands of dollars per case. And as these techniques become more standardized, as more labs develop expertise in this work, as the technology improves and becomes more efficient, the costs are coming down, making it feasible to apply these techniques to more cases. There's also the question of prioritization. Who decides which cold cases get the investigative genetic genealogy treatment and which ones remain on the shelf? Is it based on how long the case has been cold? Is it based on the circumstances of death? Is it based on whether family members are actively pushing for answers? Is it based on available resources? The uncomfortable truth is that not every case can be worked. Not every John or Jane Doe will get this level of attention, and there are inherent inequalities in how cases are prioritized. Cases involving white victims often get more resources than cases involving victims of color. Cases in wealthy jurisdictions get more resources than cases in poor jurisdictions. Cases with active family advocacy get more resources than cases where nobody's making noise. These are systemic issues that go way beyond genetic genealogy, but they're worth acknowledging. John Thieleson got lucky in a sense. His case was selected for this treatment. The Maricopa County Medical Examiner's Office chose to invest resources in identifying him. Ramapo College agreed to take on the case. Everything aligned to give him his name back. But there are thousands of other John and Jane Does who haven't been so fortunate, who are still waiting for someone to fight for them. And let's think about the mental health angle here, because John Thieleson's story is ultimately a story about mental illness and the failures of our mental health system. Here's a man who was obviously in crisis, who made statements to his family about cleansing himself and jumping into a river, who then disappeared and ended up dead in a desert 1,500 miles from home. What interventions might have saved his life? What if his family had been able to get him into immediate psychiatric care after that phone call? What if there were mobile crisis teams that could have responded? What if there were mental health resources that didn't require voluntary participation? These are difficult questions because we value individual liberty. We don't want a system where people can be locked up against their will just because they're having a mental health crisis. But we also don't want people dying alone on sidewalks in Phoenix because they weren't able or willing to access help. There's no easy answer here. It's a balance between autonomy and protection, between rights and safety. But cases like John's should push us to think harder about how we support people with serious mental illness, how we prevent them from falling through the cracks. The statistics on missing persons with mental illness are sobering. People with serious mental illness are significantly more likely to go missing than the general population. They're more likely to die when they go missing. They're less likely to be found quickly, and they're overrepresented among long-term missing persons and unidentified remains. This isn't because people with mental illness are inherently more dangerous to themselves. It's because our support systems are inadequate, because psychiatric care is expensive and hard to access, because crisis intervention resources are limited, because families often don't know how to help or what resources are available, because stigma prevents people from seeking help. John Thielison's family clearly cared about him. They filed a missing persons report. They tried to find him, but they couldn't prevent the crisis that led to his death. And that's not their fault. That's a systemic failure. That's society failing to provide adequate mental health infrastructure, failing to create safety nets that catch people before they fall through. Phoenix has made strides in recent years to address heat deaths. They've created more cooling centers. They've increased outreach to people experiencing homelessness. They've improved public education about heat safety, but people still die every summer, dozens of people, and many of them are dealing with mental illness or substance abuse issues that make them particularly vulnerable. The city's Heat Response Task Force tracks these deaths, analyzes the demographics, tries to identify interventions that might prevent future tragedies, but it's an uphill battle. When temperatures regularly exceed 110 degrees for months on end, when you have a significant population experiencing homelessness, when you have limited resources and unlimited need, people slip through the cracks, people die, and some of those people remain unidentified for years or decades until technology finally catches up and gives them their names back. That was John Thielison's fate, to die anonymously and remain anonymous for 20 years until genetic genealogy finally connected him back to his missing persons report. Think about the ripple effects of solving a case like this. John Thielison's family gets closure, but it's not just them. There are friends who wondered what happened to him, former co-workers, neighbors, people who knew him and cared about him and have carried questions for 20 years. There's his community in Toledo that gains understanding of what happened to one of their own. There are the medical examiner staff and police investigators who worked his case and can finally close the file, knowing they did everything they could. There are the students at Ramapo College who learned valuable skills and made a tangible difference in the world. There are other families with missing loved ones who see this case and realize there's hope, that even after decades there's still a chance for answers. And there are the thousands of people who will read about this case or hear about it and maybe, just maybe, decide to upload their DNA to GED Match or Family Tree DNA with law enforcement opt-in because they want to help solve the next case. The impact of solving one cold case extends far beyond just that one case. It changes systems, changes policies, changes public awareness, changes everything. The technology is only going to get better from here. DNA sequencing is becoming faster and cheaper. The genealogical databases are growing every day as more people test their DNA. The techniques for building family trees and identifying people through distant relatives are being refined and improved. Artificial intelligence is starting to play a role in analyzing genetic data and building family trees. Within the next decade, we'll probably see most long-term unidentified remains cases solved through investigative genetic genealogy. The backlog of John and Jane Does will shrink. The time between someone going missing and being identified will compress. We're moving toward a future where dying anonymously becomes increasingly rare, were the systems that failed to connect John Thielison's missing persons report to his unidentified remains for 20 years simply won't fail anymore because the technology will make those connections automatically. That's the promise of genetic genealogy. That's why cases like this matter so much. But we can't rely solely on technology to solve these problems. We also need to address the root causes. Why are people going missing in the first place? Why are people dying on the streets? Why are people with mental illness ending up far from home without support systems? Why are heat exposure deaths still happening at the rate they are? These are policy questions, funding questions, societal priority questions. Solving cold cases is important. Giving families closure is important, but preventing the cases from becoming cold in the first place is even more important. Every John Doe we identify is a life that ended tragically, often preventably. And while we should celebrate the technology that allows us to restore their names, we should also commit to building systems that prevent more people from ending up in the same situation. Better mental health infrastructure, better crisis intervention resources, better support for people experiencing homelessness, better heat relief programs, better coordination between missing persons databases and unidentified remains databases. All of these things matter. All of these things save lives. The Ramapo College IGG Center has 39 more cases they're currently working. 39 more John or Jane Does who might get their names back. 39 more families who might get closure. And beyond those 39, there are thousands more cases waiting. Every medical examiner's office in America has unidentified remains, some recent, some decades old, some that might be solvable with investigative genetic genealogy, and some that might not. But each one represents a person who deserves their identity, a family that deserves answers, and increasingly we have the tools to provide those answers. The question is whether we have the will, whether we'll invest the resources, whether we'll make solving these cases a priority. The technology exists, the techniques are proven. The success stories like John Thielison's demonstrate what's possible. Now it's up to us as a society to decide how aggressively we want to pursue this work. How many resources we want to dedicate to giving the nameless their names back. I think about John Thielison's last days sometimes. What was he thinking as he traveled from Toledo to Phoenix? Did he have a plan, or was he just wandering? Was he lucid or lost in delusion? Did he know he was in danger from the heat, or was he too confused to recognize it? Did anyone try to help him, or did everyone just walk past assuming he was someone else's problem? These questions will never be answered. We'll never fully understand his journey, or his mental state, or the exact sequence of events that led to his death. But we do know that he was someone's brother, someone's loved one, someone who mattered. And after 20 years of being nobody, of being just a case number, just a John Doe, he finally has his identity back. His family finally has answers. And that matters. That means something. That's justice, even if it's delayed justice, even if it can't undo the tragedy, even if it can't bring him back or give those 20 years back to his family. It's still something. It's still important. The announcement of John's identification came in April 2025, just a few months ago. His family is probably still processing this information, probably planning a funeral or memorial service, probably dealing with complicated grief that comes from losing someone 20 years ago, but only learning about it now. Grief therapists call this delayed grief or complicated grief. When you lose someone, but don't know it for years or decades, and then suddenly have to confront that loss all at once. It's different from normal grief because you've already gone through 20 years of ambiguous loss, 20 years of not knowing, 20 years of hoping and wondering and imagining different scenarios. And now you have to let all of that go and accept the reality. Accept that he died in 2004. Accept that you've been grieving a loss you didn't even know had occurred. It's a unique kind of pain that requires specialized support. Hopefully, John's family has access to grief counseling. Hopefully, they have support from their community. Hopefully the closure that comes with knowing will eventually help them heal, even though right now it probably feels like ripping open an old wound. And somewhere in New Jersey there are college students who worked on this case who probably feel pretty damn good about what they accomplished. They came to Ramapo College to learn forensic genealogy, and they ended up changing lives, solving a 20-year-old mystery, giving a man his name back, giving a family closure. That's the kind of impact that stays with you for your whole career. That's the kind of work that reminds you why you got into this field in the first place. And those students are going to go on to solve more cases. They're going to take the skills they learned on the John Thieleson case and apply them to the next John Doe and the next and the next. They're going to become leaders in this field. They're going to train the next generation. And the ripple effects of this one case, this one identification, will continue spreading outward for years and decades to come. That's the power of education combined with real-world application. That's the power of giving students meaningful work that matters. The medical examiner staff in Maricopa County who maintained John's case file for 20 years, who carefully preserved his remains and his DNA samples, who periodically reviewed the case, hoping for a breakthrough, they can finally mark this case as solved. They can finally close the file, knowing they did everything right, knowing that their diligence and professionalism made this identification possible. If they hadn't maintained those samples properly, if they hadn't kept good records, if they hadn't reached out to Ramapo College when the opportunity arose, John Thieleson might have remained nameless forever. That's often the unsung heroism in these cases. The people who maintain the files, who preserve the evidence, who never give up, even when years or decades pass without progress. They're the foundation that makes breakthroughs possible. They're the reason cases like this can be solved 20 years later. Toledo Police Department can now close their missing persons case on John Thieleson. After 20 years of uncertainty, they have their answer. He didn't survive. He didn't start a new life somewhere. He died in Phoenix just weeks after they filed the missing persons report. And while that's tragic, at least it's definitive. At least the case can be resolved. They can update their databases. They can notify their community. They can provide closure to any friends or associates who might have been wondering. And hopefully they can learn from this case. Hopefully they can improve their systems for coordinating missing persons reports with unidentified remains cases across jurisdictions. Hopefully the next time someone goes missing in Toledo and ends up unidentified somewhere else, the connection will be made faster, the identification will happen sooner. The family won't have to wait 20 years for answers. The future of investigative genetic genealogy is incredibly promising. We're just scratching the surface of what's possible. As more people upload their DNA to databases, as the algorithms for analyzing genetic relationships improve, as artificial intelligence gets better at building and analyzing family trees, as the costs come down and the techniques become more accessible, we're going to see more and more cold cases solved, more and more John and Jane Does identified, more and more families getting closure, and beyond just identification. Genetic genealogy is solving murders, identifying serial killers, solving rapes and assaults, catching perpetrators who thought they got away with their crimes decades ago. It's revolutionizing criminal justice. It's giving victims justice they never thought they'd see, and it's giving families of victims peace they never thought they'd have. The technology isn't perfect. It has limitations and ethical concerns that need to be addressed. But the potential for good is enormous. John Thieleson's story is one story among thousands. Thousands of missing persons, thousands of unidentified remains, thousands of families waiting for answers. But his story matters because it shows what's possible. It shows that even 20 years later, even when traditional investigative techniques have failed, even when it seems hopeless, there's still a chance, there's still hope. There are still people working these cases, still advancing the technology, still fighting to give the nameless their names back. And every success, every identification, every case solved brings us one step closer to a future where dying anonymously is a thing of the past, where missing persons are found quickly, where families don't have to suffer for decades wondering what happened to their loved ones. That's the world we're building. Case by case, identification by identification. And the John Thieleson case is one more brick in that foundation. So what's the takeaway here? What should we learn from this case? First, investigative genetic genealogy works. It's proven, it's reliable. It's revolutionizing how we solve cold cases and identify unknown remains. If you're in a position to support this work, if you're a policymaker or a law enforcement official or someone who controls budgets, invest in it, fund it, make it a priority. The return on investment in terms of cases solved and families helped is enormous. Second, if you've done consumer DNA testing, consider opting into law enforcement use on GED match or family tree DNA. Your DNA might be the key to solving a case, might be what gives a family closure, might be what identifies the next John or Jane Doe. Yes, there are privacy considerations, but the potential to do good is significant. Third, mental health matters. John Thielison's death was ultimately a result of untreated or inadequately treated mental illness. We need better crisis intervention, better access to psychiatric care, better support systems for people and families dealing with serious mental illness. We need to destigmatize mental health treatment and make it easier for people to get help before they reach crisis points. Fourth, systems need to talk to each other better. The fact that a missing persons report in Toledo and an unidentified remains case in Phoenix existed simultaneously for 20 years without being connected is a systemic failure. We have better technology now, we have better databases, but we need to make sure they're actually communicating across jurisdictions. And fifth, never give up. The medical examiners who kept John's case active for 20 years. The families who keep pushing for answers even after decades. The students and professionals who work these cases, they all demonstrate that persistence matters, that maintaining hope matters, that every case is solvable if we're willing to put in the work and use the tools available to us. John Thieleson got his name back because people refused to give up, because technology advanced, because systems improved, and because dedicated individuals decided his case mattered enough to invest the time and resources needed to solve it. Every John and Jane Doe deserves that same level of commitment, that same determination to restore their identity and give their families peace. And increasingly, we have the ability to deliver on that promise. The 12,000 unidentified remains in America right now, each one is someone's son or daughter, someone's brother or sister, someone's parent or friend. Each one is a mystery waiting to be solved, a family waiting for answers, a life waiting to be honored with a name and a proper burial. And thanks to investigative genetic genealogy, thanks to programs like the one at Ramapo College, thanks to medical examiners and cold case units willing to embrace new technology, we're solving these mysteries. We're giving families peace. We're restoring dignity to the dead. One case at a time, one identification at a time, one family at a time. This is the future of forensic investigation. This is how we honor the dead and help the living. This is how we turn tragedy into closure, mystery into answers, nameless victims into remembered individuals. John Thieleson was lost for 20 years, but now he's found. His family suffered for 2 decades, but now they have peace. His case was cold, but now it's solved. And somewhere out there right now, college students are working on the next case, building family trees, analyzing DNA, making connections, bringing the next John or Jane Doe home, giving the next family their answers. And that work will continue case after case, year after year, until every unidentified remain has a name, until every missing person is accounted for, until no family has to suffer the torture of not knowing. That's the promise. That's the goal. And cases like John Thieleson's prove we can get there. We have the technology. We have the determination. We have the compassion. Now we just need to keep going. Keep fighting, keep solving, because every case matters. Every name matters, every family matters. And John Thielisson, after 20 years of being nobody, finally matters again, finally has his identity, finally can rest in peace with his name restored and his family able to say goodbye, and that ultimately is what justice looks like in the 21st century. Let me tell you something that doesn't get talked about enough in cases like John Thielisson's. The infrastructure of hope, the network of people and organizations that exist specifically to keep hope alive when everyone else has moved on. When the media stops covering the story, when the general public forgets, when even some family members start to accept that they'll never know what happened. There are people who don't forget, who don't give up, who maintain databases and files and records with meticulous care because they understand that someday, somehow, the answer might come. Jessica Kearns, with Missing People in America, is one of those people. The staff at NamUs, who maintain the National Missing and Unidentified Person System, are those people. The cold case detectives who pull out old files on slow days and review them one more time are those people. The medical examiners who treat unidentified remains with dignity and respect, knowing that someday someone might come looking are those people. And now we can add the Ramapo College students to that list. Young people in their late teens and early 20s who are learning that you can make a real difference in the world, that you can ease someone's suffering, that you can bring peace to families who have been suffering for decades. Imagine being 21 years old and solving a case that professional investigators couldn't crack for 20 years. Imagine the confidence that gives you, the sense of purpose. The understanding that your work has meaning beyond just earning a grade or completing an assignment. The educational model at Ramapo College is worth examining because it represents a shift in how we train forensic professionals. Traditionally, forensic science education has been largely theoretical. Students learn in classrooms and labs. They work with simulated evidence and hypothetical scenarios. They graduate with knowledge but limited practical experience. But the IGG Center flips that model. Students are working real cases from day one. They're building actual family trees for actual unidentified remains. They're making actual connections that lead to actual identifications. Yes, they're supervised. Yes, they have experienced professionals guiding them. But they're doing the work. They're making the discoveries. And when a case is solved, they can point to their contribution and say, I did that. I helped solve that. I gave that family closure. That's transformative education. That's learning that sticks with you for life. And it's creating a pipeline of highly skilled forensic genealogists who will go on to work in medical examiner offices, police departments, federal agencies, private firms, spreading these techniques and skills throughout the entire criminal justice system. Think about the economics of this model, too. By using students as the primary labor force for genealogical research, Ramapo College can offer their services to medical examiner offices and law enforcement agencies at a fraction of what private forensic genealogy firms charge. A private firm might charge $20,000 to $50,000 to work a case like John Thielisson's. That's a lot of money for a county medical examiner with a limited budget, but Ramapo's model makes it affordable. The medical examiner pays for the lab work, the DNA extraction and sequencing, but the hundreds of hours of genealogical research that goes into building those family trees and tracking down records, that's provided as part of the college's educational program. It's a win-win situation. Students get invaluable hands-on experience. Medical examiners get world-class forensic genealogy services at affordable rates. And families get answers. That's smart policy. That's innovative thinking, and it's a model that should be replicated at universities across the country. Imagine if every state had a program like Ramapo's. Imagine how many cold cases could be solved, how many families could get closure. But let's talk about something uncomfortable. Something that needs to be addressed when we discuss cases like John Thielisson's, the inequality in whose cases get solved. whose deaths get investigated, whose families get closure. John was a white man from Ohio. His case got picked up by Ramapo College, got the full genetic genealogy treatment, got solved after 20 years. But what about the Hispanic John Doe found in the desert outside Tucson? What about the black Jane Doe found in Detroit? What about the indigenous person who went missing from a reservation and whose case never even got properly documented? These disparities exist throughout the criminal justice system, and they exist in cold case investigation too. Cases involving white victims, especially white women and children, get disproportionate attention and resources compared to cases involving people of color. This is a documented phenomenon called missing white woman syndrome. And while we've made progress in recent years in recognizing and addressing these disparities, they still exist. They still affect which cases get solved and which cases remain cold. The good news is that investigative genetic genealogy as a technology is actually somewhat equalizing. DNA doesn't care about race or class or social status. If you have a biological sample and that person has relatives who've uploaded their DNA to databases, the technique works the same regardless of who the victim is. The challenge is in the selection process. Who decides which cases get submitted to programs like Ramapo's? Who decides which cases get the funding for DNA extraction and sequencing? Who decides which cases are priorities? These are human decisions made by people with conscious and unconscious biases. And unless we actively work to counteract those biases, we'll continue to see disparities in which cases get solved. The solution is transparency, accountability, and intentional effort to prioritize cases that have historically been neglected. Cases involving marginalized communities. Cases that didn't get adequate investigation when they were fresh. Cases where the victim was experiencing homelessness or dealing with addiction or engaged in sex work. People whose lives were devalued in death, just as they were often devalued in life. John Tillerson's mental health struggles are central to his story, but they're also representative of a much larger crisis. According to the Treatment Advocacy Center, individuals with untreated serious mental illness are significantly overrepresented among both the homeless population and the incarcerated population. They're more likely to be victims of violent crime, more likely to die young, more likely to end up in situations exactly like John's, where they're far from home, confused, vulnerable, and in danger. The mental health system in America is broken, has been broken for decades. We closed state psychiatric hospitals in the 1970s and 80s, promising community-based care that never materialized. We criminalized mental illness by default, filling our jails and prisons with people who need treatment, not punishment. And we created a revolving door where people cycle between emergency rooms, jails, homeless shelters, and the streets without ever getting the sustained psychiatric care they need. John Tillerson's death in Phoenix is a symptom of these systemic failures. His family couldn't get him the help he needed. The system couldn't keep him safe. And he ended up dying alone in a desert city 1,500 miles from home. What would it have taken to prevent John's death? That's the question we should be asking. If Toledo had robust mobile crisis intervention teams in 2004, teams that could have responded when John made that disturbing call to his sister, could they have prevented him from leaving? Could they have gotten him into psychiatric care, maybe? If Ohio had better civil commitment laws that allowed families to get treatment for loved ones in acute crisis, even without their consent, could John's family have gotten him hospitalized, maybe? If America had a functional mental health system with adequate funding and infrastructure, could John have gotten treatment before he reached crisis point? Probably, but we don't have those things. We have a patchwork system with massive gaps. We have families struggling to navigate complex bureaucracies while their loved ones are in crisis. We have emergency rooms that stabilize people and then discharge them back to the streets because there are no psychiatric beds available. We have a society that still stigmatizes mental illness and treats it as a personal failing rather than a medical condition. And the result is people dying, people ending up unidentified in medical examiner offices, people becoming statistics in someone's research paper on the failures of deinstitutionalization. The heat crisis in Phoenix deserves its own examination because it's not just a natural disaster. It's a policy failure, a social failure, a failure of prioritization and resource allocation. Phoenix has known for decades that heat kills vulnerable people every summer. They have data, they have statistics, they know who's most at risk and where and when. And yes, they've implemented cooling centers and public education campaigns and outreach programs, but people still die, dozens every year. And many of those deaths are preventable. The city could do more. Could invest more in permanent supportive housing for people experiencing homelessness. Could expand mental health services. Could create more shaded public spaces. Could improve public transportation so people aren't waiting for buses in 115-degree heat. Could station outreach workers in areas where vulnerable people congregate. Could do 100 different things that would save lives. But those things cost money and require political will and compete with other priorities. So people die. And some of those people remain unidentified for years or decades until genetic genealogy gives them their names back. There's a broader conversation we need to have about how we value human life, about whose deaths matter and whose deaths are treated as inevitable casualties of urban life. When a hiker dies in the Arizona desert, it makes the news. Search and rescue teams deploy. Helicopters search. The community mourns. But when a homeless person dies from heat exposure on a Phoenix sidewalk, it barely registers. Maybe a brief mention in the local news. Maybe a line item in the medical examiner's annual statistics. But no outrage. No calls for systemic change. No sense that this death was preventable and therefore unacceptable. John Tillison's death should have been a scandal. A 42-year-old man dies from heat exposure on a downtown sidewalk in a major American city and remains unidentified for 20 years. That should prompt investigations, policy changes, accountability, but it didn't. It just became another cold case. Another file in a cabinet, another unidentified remain, waiting for technology to catch up. And that tells you something about how we value certain lives, about whose deaths we consider tragic and whose deaths we consider inevitable. The Golden State Killer case in 2018 was the watershed moment for investigative genetic genealogy. That's when law enforcement and the public really understood what this technology could do. Joseph James DeAngelo had terrorized California in the 70s and 80s, committing at least 13 murders and 50 rapes. And he got away with it. Decades passed. The case went cold. Conventional DNA testing couldn't identify him because he wasn't in any criminal databases. But then, investigators uploaded the crime scene DNA to GDmatch, found distant relatives, built family trees, narrowed down suspects, and identified DeAngelo, arrested him, charged him, got justice for victims and families who thought they'd never see it. That case proved the technique worked, proved it could solve supposedly unsolvable cases. And it sparked a revolution in cold case investigation. Suddenly, every law enforcement agency wanted to use genetic genealogy. Medical examiners started submitting unidentified remains cases. Families of murder victims started advocating for their loved ones' cases to get this treatment. And the field exploded. New companies formed. Training programs developed, universities created forensic genealogy programs, and cases that had been cold for decades started getting solved. The Golden State Killer case gave hope to thousands of families, showed them that even 40 years later justice was possible, and that hope is what drives people like the Ramapo College students, drives them to spend hundreds of hours building family trees for people they never knew. People like John Tillison, since the Golden State Killer case in 2018. Investigative genetic genealogy has been used to solve hundreds of cold cases, murders mostly, but also missing persons and unidentified remains. The technique has been refined, the success rate has improved, the costs have come down, and the ethical frameworks have been developed. Most reputable organizations now follow strict protocols. They only use databases where users have explicitly opted into law enforcement use. They only upload DNA from crime scenes or unidentified remains, not from suspects or persons of interest. They don't use the technique for minor crimes or for crimes that don't involve violence or death. They maintain chain of custody and documentation standards. They work with legal counsel to ensure everything is done properly. And they're transparent about their methods. This is important because the technique is powerful, and like any powerful tool, it can be misused. We need oversight. We need ethical guidelines. We need transparency. We need to balance the incredible good this technology can do against the legitimate privacy concerns it raises. And mostly we're getting that balance right. Mostly the technique is being used responsibly to solve serious crimes and identify the dead. But we need to remain vigilant, need to ensure that genetic genealogy doesn't become a tool for surveillance or social control, doesn't get used to violate privacy without adequate justification, doesn't create a world where having DNA becomes a liability rather than just a biological fact. The future applications of this technology are fascinating and slightly terrifying, depending on your perspective. Right now, we're using genetic genealogy primarily for criminal investigation and identifying remains, but the same techniques could theoretically be used for many other purposes. Immigration enforcement could use it to verify family relationships. Intelligence agencies could use it to identify foreign operatives. Corporations could use it for competitive intelligence or to identify whistleblowers. Authoritarian governments could use it for population control or to identify dissidents. The technology itself is neutral, but the applications can be good or evil depending on who's using it and why. That's why we need strong legal frameworks now. Before the technology gets too far ahead of the law, we need legislation that clearly defines when and how genetic genealogy can be used, what databases can be accessed, what oversight is required, what penalties exist for misuse. And we need those laws to be based on constitutional principles, on privacy rights, on the understanding that genetic information is fundamentally different from other types of information, because it reveals not just facts about you, but facts about your relatives, about people who never consented to have their genetic information used for anything. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.